I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about Venezuela and the recent power outages that have occurred in Caracas and throughout the country. Interesting timing for these power outages. There's a lot of theories floating around as to what caused them. You can get into that. And I also want to discuss in this video a little bit about the UN report before all of this stuff started to come about, this regime change from the Trump White House. The UN report by Alfredo de Zayas, where he actually went to Venezuela and did a pretty thorough study as to what's causing a lot of the turmoil in Venezuela. And he came out with a very, very different conclusion as to the regular narrative that you hear about dictator Maduro and socialist, economy and all that stuff. So let's start with the breaking news, the current news about these power outages, and let's move it to the UN report.
Right. Well, let's deal with as you said, the power outages. Now, of course, we have conflicting accounts of what's caused them. There's no question at all that they have been, in terms of electric power generation, absolutely devastating. I mean, Caracas has been for hours without electricity. I think it's sporadically coming on, but there's been repeated problems with the electrical infrastructure in Venezuela, and it's been a massive struggle getting this power cut resolved. Now, the Venezuelan authorities are saying quite clearly that these are the results of cyber attacks. The US government and the people in the US are denying this. They're saying it's all a sign of mismanagement and corruption within Venezuela. I don't know what the truth is, but I think it is highly likely, to the point of being extremely probable, that it was a cyber attack. The United States has a history of launching cyber attacks against Iran to try and interfere with the Iranian nuclear program. They've talked openly about launching cyber attacks on infrastructure in other countries, including Russia, by the way. Why would they not launch cyber attacks against the infrastructure of a country like Venezuela, when it is their openly proclaimed intention to achieve regime change there? I would have thought this was an entirely natural thing to expect in this kind of situation. The United States is known to have that capability. I think almost certainly, this is my own view, almost certainly it was a cyber attack, and the United States were the people who did it. I can't prove it. I don't know for a fact, but that's my view. Now, let's go to the Zayas report, because I think this is extraordinarily interesting. Now, he was there for the United Nations in August 2018. He is a Cuban American. He is a lawyer. He is a US citizen. I believe he is from Chicago, in fact. He's done lots of work for the United Nations, and he is somebody whose opinions ought to be taken extremely seriously. When he visited Venezuela in August 2018, what he said was that the country was going through a very severe economic crisis, but that it was nowhere close to being any kind of humanitarian crisis. To the extent, moreover, that there is an economic crisis in Venezuela, the cause of that economic crisis has at the very least been aggravated and made much worse by economic sanctions which have been imposed on Venezuela by the United States and by other Western countries. So there is no humanitarian crisis, according to him, in Venezuela, or at least there wasn't in August. Max Blumenthal, who we know has been to Venezuela and has done a program there, says essentially the same thing. If there is a growing humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and growing economic disruption, as we have seen most probably with these cyber attacks, it is the United States which is itself causing them, and is causing them as part of its attempt to change the government there. And that is highly relevant to this very strange episode of 2 weeks ago when they provided humanitarian aid to a country which it turns out doesn't need it.
Paul Craig Roberts did an excellent kind of crystallization of the Desaias report. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from that report, Alexander, from paragraph 37. And I want you to comment on it. And I think it is directly related to the humanitarian aid effort from Colombia to bring the trucks in, as well as this possible cyber attack on their electrical grid. And I quote from the Desaias report: "Modern-day economic sanctions and blockades are comparable with medieval sieges of towns with the intention of forcing them to surrender. 21st century sanctions attempt to bring not just a town, but sovereign countries to their knees. A difference, perhaps, is that 21st century sanctions are accompanied by the manipulation of public opinion through fake news, aggressive public relations, and a pseudo-human rights rhetoric so as to give the impression that human rights end justifies the criminal means." This was done in August, before the Venezuela crisis was brought to the public's attention. Alexander, what do you make of Desaias' summarization here?
I mean, it is a passionate statement of what I would regard as the truth. Now, let me make a few points here. First of all, I do not attribute all of Venezuela's problems, economic problems, to US sanctions. I accept that there has been considerable mismanagement by the Venezuelan government. I made the parallel before with the Assad government in Syria, which, despite the fact that it's also been sanctioned and has had to endure a war on its territory, has managed the economy of Syria quite well and has managed to avoid hyperinflation. Venezuela has failed to do these things, and there are clearly serious governance issues there. Also, I would further add that it is the sovereign right of any country to trade with any other country. If the United States does not want to trade with Venezuela, there may be breaches of, WTO treaties and such things. But ultimately, that is the business of the United States. What is the crime? And I think Desaias is absolutely right when he talks about a crime, is when one country, which is the United States, not only refuses to trade with another country, which in this case is Venezuela, but tries to take measures to force other countries from trading with that country, i.e. Venezuela also, when it tries to place Venezuela under economic blockade. And this is where Desaias talks about, placing a town, a medieval town, under siege, and where he makes the parallel. And that, it seems to me, is exactly what we are seeing. I think he is describing it exactly right. The United States is trying to impose a blockade of Venezuela in order to create such a severe crisis within the country that it will force the change of the government there. And it is doing that heedless of the consequences on the Venezuelan people. So there is a well-known principle in international law that you do not impose collective punishments on civilian populations, but that, it seems, is what the United States, in the case of Venezuela, is actually doing.
Will this continue? Will we continue to see actions like, possibly the hacking of the electrical grid and humanitarian aid stunts and stuff like this? Will we see this going on for an extended period? Or do you think eventually we're going to just get to a point where the Boltons and the Abrams say, you know what, it's time to start, bringing in some military intervention here?
I think the answer is that I'm afraid I take an Omer's view. I think they will escalate. I mean, we've discussed this many times. These people are not going to give up easily. I mean, they've committed themselves and the prestige of the United States to achieving regime change in Venezuela. They're not going to give up quickly. They've made various attempts over the last few weeks to try to stage a political crisis in Venezuela by recognizing Guaido as the legitimate president, talking to the army to try to get it to rebel against the legitimate Maduro government, creating a crisis or trying to create a crisis on Venezuela's borders by trying to send humanitarian aid into Venezuela, as it turns out, by force. All those attempts have failed. So now it is entirely logical that they would be escalating. And we've seen already threats made to other countries or to companies in other countries, specifically banks, that if they start dealing with Venezuela, there will be sanctions placed upon them. We've seen, as I said, these power blackouts, which, as I said, I believe are almost certainly due to cyber attacks. And I suspect we're going to see more of the same. If none of those things work, and especially if the countermeasures that the Chinese and especially the Russians are taking to try to help Venezuela resist these pressures, and it seems that Russia now is not only importing increasing amounts of Venezuelan oil, but is now starting to refine Venezuela's oil for it, which was a difficult thing to do because of the nature of Venezuela's oil. If these pressures fail, then I'm afraid it is highly likely, given the kind of people we're talking about, people like Elliot Abrams, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, that they will demand further escalation, such as perhaps a naval blockade or, perish the thought, attempts to carry out some kind of military action, most probably at the beginning by promoting an insurgency within Venezuela, but conceivably something even worse further down the line involving U.S. troops.
Yeah, I mean, I see the humanitarian aid, the truck gimmick, and I see this electrical blackout stuff. All these things are, in essence, like Desaya says, these are types of siege warfare. So now you're saying that they're going to start ratcheting up the pressure on the financial sector. But at the end of the day, all roads lead to some sort of military intervention, maybe along the lines of a Syria style, fomenting kind of a civil war kind of thing, or who God knows what they're going to think of. But it seems that's where the road is leading towards.
I'm afraid so. I mean, we're not there, and
right.
And let's hope we don't get there. But these people have form. Elliot Abrams has lots of form, and it seems to me that that's where this thing is heading. I don't expect these people to back off. The big question is whether Donald Trump will play along with it and will allow the United States to be sucked into another regime change operation of this kind, and whether US public and political opinion will go along with it also. I get the sense that there is already starting to be a swing against it in the United States. But these are uncertain prospects. And all one can say is that, as I said, all these sort of people, they don't have a reverse gear. People like Bolton, Pence, Pompeo, Abrams, they don't have a reverse gear, and they're more likely to drive on.
Right. They're working, all these neocons, they're never going to back down, the neocons, but they're working with the 2020 time clock. Exactly. Kind of sitting there, and the big question is, how does that affect their regime change plans?
Exactly. But of course, being conscious of that clock, as you said, may make them want to escalate further and faster than they might otherwise do, because they will want probably to see something happen in Venezuela before the 2020 election looms on the horizon.
Right. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. In the description box down below, you'll find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Please donate to the Duran. It really helps us out. And you can get a copy of this video in audio format. Follow us on Soundcloud and on iTunes. Go to theduran.com and see all the articles that Alexander is reading every day. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you once again. Until next time, take care.